Life on the streets of downtown Atlanta wasn't easy for the 14-year-old boy and his mother. Each morning, as the sun peeked through the city's towering buildings, they would pack up their few belongings into their worn backpacks, a routine they'd perfected over the past 6 months since losing their apartment. "You've got your books?" his mother would ask every morning, dark circles under her eyes from working late shifts at various temporary jobs. Despite their circumstances, she never lost her gentle smile or her determination to keep her son in school. "Yes, Mom," he'd reply, carefully zipping up his backpack that contained not just his schoolbooks, but also their toothbrushes and a change of clothes. Their life had been reduced to what they could carry, but they carried their dignity with even greater care. The boy was always early to school, not because he was particularly eager for classes to begin, but because the school's bathroom was the only reliable place where he could wash up properly. He'd learnt to arrive before most other students, giving himself time to freshen up and change into his cleanest shirt. No one at school knew about his situation, and he preferred to keep it that way. Despite sleeping in different shelters each night, and sometimes, when the shelters were full, in the back of the church basement where a kind pastor would secretly let them in, the boy maintained exceptional grades. Math was his favorite subject. Numbers made sense to him in a way that his current life situation didn't. When he solved equations, he felt in control, something that was rare in his everyday life. His mother worked whatever jobs she could find, washing dishes at restaurants, cleaning offices after hours, helping at laundromats. Every dollar she earned went into a small tin can, hoping to save enough for a security deposit on an apartment. "We'll have a home again," she'd promise him every night as they settled into whatever temporary sleeping arrangement they'd found. "Just keep studying hard." The boy watched how his mother would skip meals, claiming she wasn't hungry, just so he could eat. He saw how she would walk miles to save bus fare, how she would mend their clothes by hand to avoid spending money on new ones. Through it all, she never complained, never lost hope, and never stopped encouraging him to dream big. Their mornings often started at the local community center, where they could use the facilities to get ready for the day. Other homeless folks knew them there, the quiet boy who always had his nose in a book, and his hard-working mother who never failed to offer a kind word to others, even when she was exhausted. School became his sanctuary. In the classroom, he wasn't a homeless kid, he was just another student. His teachers noticed his talent, especially in science and math. "You have a gift," his math teacher would tell him after he'd solved particularly challenging problems. Those words gave him hope, making him dream of a future where he could use these skills to lift himself and his mother out of their current situation. Every afternoon, when school ended, he'd help his mother at whatever job she had that day. Sometimes he'd fold laundry at the laundromat where she worked, or help clean offices, always making sure to finish his homework during breaks. They were a team, mother and son, facing the world together. What made their situation even harder was knowing they once had a stable life. Just 6 months ago, they had lived in a small but cozy apartment. His mother had a steady job at a local grocery store. But when the store closed down and the rent increased, their world crumbled quickly. The boy learned then how fragile stability could be, how quickly life could change. Yet through it all, his mother taught him something invaluable, that their circumstances didn't define their character. "We might be homeless," she would say, "but we're not hopeless. As long as we have each other and our integrity, we have everything that truly matters." Little did they know that their lives were about to change dramatically, all because of a simple choice the boy would make the next morning, a choice that would test their values and ultimately prove that his mother's words about integrity were more powerful than either of them could have imagined. The morning that changed everything started like any other. The autumn air was crisp, and fallen leaves crunched under the boy's worn sneakers as he walked his usual route through Piedmont Park to school. He'd left early, as always, giving himself plenty of time to get ready in the school bathroom before other students arrived. His stomach growled as he walked. They hadn't had much for breakfast, just some crackers and water. His mother had promised they'd have a proper meal that evening if her temporary cleaning job worked out. He tried not to think about food, instead focusing on the math test he had later that day. Numbers were easier to deal with than hunger. The park was quiet at this hour, with just a few early morning joggers and people walking their dogs. The boy liked this peaceful time of day when the rising sun painted the Atlanta skyline in soft colors. He'd often imagined what it would be like to live in one of those tall buildings, to have a real home again. That's when he saw it, a designer purse sitting alone on a park bench. At first he walked past it, but something made him stop and turn around. The purse looked expensive, the kind he'd seen in store windows but never up close. It was made of soft brown leather and seemed out of place on the weathered wooden bench. He looked around. There was no one nearby who might be the owner. With cautious steps, he approached the bench and carefully opened the purse, hoping to find some identification. His eyes widened at what he found inside: several credit cards, a smartphone, and most surprisingly, a thick envelope containing $500 in cash. For a moment, he just stared at the money. $500, that was more than his mother earned in a week of temporary jobs. It was enough for several nights in motel, enough for real meals instead of shelter food, enough to buy new clothes for both of them. His hands trembled as he held the envelope. But then he heard his mother's voice in his head. Our circumstances don't define our character. She had taught him that even when you have nothing, you still have your integrity. That was something no one could take away from you, but you could give it away by making the wrong choices. Looking through the purse more carefully, he found a stack of business cards. They belonged to a real estate developer with an office address in Buckhead, one of the city's wealthiest areas. The cards had a phone number, but he didn't have a phone to call with. He'd have to deliver it in person. He checked his watch. If he hurried, he could still make it to school on time after dropping off the purse. But Buckhead was on the other side of town. He'd have to skip school, something his mother had always insisted he should never do. Yet somehow he felt she would understand this time. The journey took over an hour, requiring 3 different bus transfers. He used the last of his lunch money for bus fare, clutching the purse tightly to his chest the whole way. Some passengers gave him suspicious looks. A young boy in worn clothes carrying an expensive purse. He tried to ignore their stares. As he watched the neighborhoods change through the bus windows, from his familiar downtown streets to the manicured lawns and luxury cars of Buckhead, he felt increasingly out of place. The buildings grew taller, the stores more exclusive, and his own reflection in the bus window seemed to shrink. Finally, he arrived at the address on the business card, a gleaming office building that seemed to touch the clouds. The security guard at the front desk eyed him suspiciously as he approached. The boy's heart was pounding, but he stood up straight and spoke clearly, just as his mother had taught him. "Excuse me, sir," he said politely. "I found this purse in Piedmont Park this morning. It belongs to someone who works in this building." He held up the purse and the business card as proof. The guard's expression changed from suspicion to surprise. He picked up his phone and made a call, all while keeping one eye on the boy who stood patiently, still clutching the purse. The boy could hear his own heart beating in his ears as he waited, wondering if he'd done the right thing by coming all this way. What he didn't know then was that this moment, this simple act of honesty, was about to set in motion a chain of events that would transform not only his life, but the lives of many others. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest choices, and standing there in that imposing lobby, he was about to learn just how true that could be. The minutes felt like hours as the boy stood in the gleaming lobby, trying not to stare at his own reflection in the polished marble floor. Around him, well-dressed business people hurried past, some giving him curious glances, others barely noticing him at all. He gripped the purse tighter, fighting the urge to run back to the familiar streets he knew. "She'll be down in a moment," the security guard said, his tone notably softer now. He'd been watching the boy, perhaps surprised that someone so young had made such an effort to return a lost item. "You can have a seat over there if you'd like." But the boy remained standing. His mother had always taught him to show respect, and somehow, sitting in one of those expensive-looking leather chairs didn't feel right. Instead, he focused on the gentle hum of the elevators, counting them as they went up and down, using numbers to calm his nerves just as he did during difficult math tests. The elevator chimed, and a woman stepped out. She was dressed in a business suit that probably cost more than 6 months of his mother's earnings. Her heels clicked purposefully across the lobby floor as she approached, her expression a mixture of curiosity and surprise. "I understand you found my purse?" she asked, her voice warm but cautious. Up close, she looked tired despite her polished appearance, as if she too had been having a long day. "Yes, ma'am," the boy replied, holding out the purse. I found it on a bench in Piedmont Park this morning. Everything's still inside. Your cards, your phone, and," he hesitated slightly, "the envelope with the money." The woman's eyes widened as she quickly looked through the purse. "The money's all here," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She looked up at him sharply. "Do you know how much was in this envelope?" $500, ma'am," he answered honestly. "I counted it to make sure nothing had fallen out when I found the purse." She studied him for a moment, taking in his worn clothes and scuffed shoes. "You came all the way from Piedmont Park to return this? That must have taken you over an hour on the bus." "3 buses, actually," he said with a small smile. "But my mom always says doing the right thing isn't supposed to be easy. It just needs to be done." The woman's expression softened at his words. She glanced at her watch, then back at the boy. "Have you had lunch yet?" she asked suddenly. The boy shook his head. He'd spent his lunch money on bus fare, but he didn't mention that part. "Well, I think this deserves more than just a thank you. Would you join me in my office? We can order some food, and I'd like to hear more about this mother of yours who taught you such important lessons." For a moment, the boy hesitated. His mother had always warned him about going anywhere with strangers, but they were in a public building with security guards and cameras everywhere. Plus, his stomach was growling loud enough that he worried she might hear it. "I don't want to take up your time, ma'am," he said politely. "I just wanted to return what was yours." The woman smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Young man, you've already given up your entire morning to do the right thing. Let me at least give you lunch in return. Besides," she added, "that money you returned was for an important business deal. You may have saved more than just my day." As they walked to the elevator together, the security guard gave the boy a thumbs up when the woman wasn't looking. The boy smiled back, feeling a little more at ease. The elevator rode smoothly up to the 47th floor, and the boy couldn't help but gasp at the view of Atlanta spreading out below them through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Some way down there was the shelter where his mother would be working today, the school he should have been at, the park bench where this all began. The woman's office was larger than the entire room he and his mother shared at the shelter. She gestured for him to sit in a comfortable chair while she ordered lunch from a nearby deli. As they waited for the food, she asked him about school, and his eyes lit up when he talked about his love for mathematics and science. What the boy didn't realize was that this conversation would be the beginning of something much bigger than a simple lost and found story. Sometimes life's biggest blessings come disguised as small moments of honesty, and as he sat there, answering this kind woman's questions, fate was quietly weaving a new pattern into the fabric of his future. The walk to the office building where the boy's mother worked was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. The real estate developer's heels clicked against the sidewalk as she matched her pace to the boy's shorter steps. Every few blocks, he would look up at her uncertainly, as if still not quite believing this was real. They found his mother in an empty office, methodically wiping down windows. She was a small woman, thin but strong, with tired eyes that still managed to hold warmth. When she turned and saw her son standing there during school hours, her face filled with concern. "What happened? Why aren't you in school?" she asked, immediately putting down her cleaning supplies. Then she noticed the well-dressed woman standing beside him, and her worry deepened. "Mom," the boy started, "something happened this morning." He told her everything. Finding the purse, making the decision to skip school, taking the 3 buses across town. As he spoke, his mother's expression changed from concern to understanding and finally to pride. The developer stepped forward then, introducing herself. "Your son did something extraordinary today," she said. "He returned my purse with $500 in cash inside, and honestly, that's the least remarkable thing about him." The mother's eyes welled with tears. "That's my boy," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We might not have much, but we have our values." "About that," the developer said, pulling out her phone. "I'd like to make some calls, if you'll let me. You see, your son helped me see something important today, something I should have seen a long time ago." Over the next hour, as the mother continued her cleaning work, she insisted on finishing her shift. The developer made call after call. Her voice echoed through the empty office as she spoke to various people, using terms like immediate placement and priority housing. Finally, she turned to mother and son with a smile. "I have something to show you if you're willing to trust me for a little while longer." 20 minutes later, their cab pulled up in front of a modern apartment building. It wasn't the fanciest in Atlanta, but it was clean and well-maintained, with a small playground visible from the street. The developer led them to a second-floor apartment and unlocked the door. "This is one of our transitional housing units," she explained, leading them inside. "It's fully furnished, 2 bedrooms, and it's available immediately." The boy and his mother stood in stunned silence, taking in the modest but comfortable living room, the clean kitchen with its working appliances, the bedrooms with real beds, not shelter cots. "I don't understand," his mother finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "My company owns this building," the developer explained. "We keep several units available for families in transition, but that's not all." She turned to face the mother directly. "We also have an opening for a full-time maintenance supervisor. The position comes with benefits, including health insurance. The previous supervisor just retired, and after seeing how meticulously you clean, I think you'd be perfect for the role." The mother shook her head, overwhelmed. "But I don't have experience supervising." "You have the most important kind of experience," the developer interrupted gently. "You know what it means to care for a space, to take pride in your work. We can teach you the rest. Besides," she smiled, "anyone who can raise a son like yours while facing such challenges clearly knows how to manage difficult situations." The boy watched as his mother's hands trembled. This is too much," she said. "No," the developer replied firmly. "This is exactly right. Your son showed me today that sometimes the smallest actions can have the biggest impact. When he found my purse, he could have made a different choice, but he chose integrity, just as you've chosen integrity every day while fighting to keep him in school and give him a better future." She pulled out some papers from her briefcase. "The apartment is yours if you want it, the job too." And she added, looking at the boy, "I have some friends at a local engineering firm who run a mentorship program for promising students. I think they'd be very interested in meeting you." The mother pulled her son close, tears flowing freely now. The boy felt his own eyes getting wet as he looked around the apartment, a real home, with real walls and a real kitchen where his mother could cook again. "I should warn you, though," the developer said with a small smile, "the maintenance supervisor position is demanding. You'll need to take some evening classes in property management." But she looked meaningfully at the boy. "I hear your family values education." As mother and son stood in what would become their new home, the developer watched them quietly. She thought about all the development projects she overseen, all the buildings she'd helped raise into the sky. But standing there, watching this small family begin to realize their lives were about to change, she understood that this might be the most important development project of her career. Sometimes the best investments aren't in buildings at all, but in people. And sometimes it takes a child's simple act of honesty to remind us of that truth. The changes that came over the next year seemed almost magical to the boy, though they were built on hard work and determination. Their new apartment quickly became a real home, filled with the sounds and smells he remembered from before their time on the streets. The simple act of having keys in his pocket, of knowing exactly where he'd sleep each night, felt like a miracle that never got old. His mother threw herself into her new role as maintenance supervisor with the same dedication she'd shown in everything else. Each morning, she put on her navy blue uniform with pride, the name tag gleaming on her chest. The other maintenance workers quickly grew to respect her attention to detail and her kind but firm leadership style. "Your mom's something else," one of the older workers told the boy one day. "She can spot a leaky pipe from a mile away, and she always makes sure we do things right the first time." The boy had smiled, feeling a fresh wave of pride. His mother had always been extraordinary, now others could see it too. In the evenings, after her shift ended, his mother would head to her property management classes at the community college. She'd sit at their small kitchen table, textbooks spread out around her, studying concepts like building codes and tenant laws with the same determination she'd once shown in making their shelter meals stretch further. The boy would sit across from her, doing his own homework. Sometimes they'd quiz each other. He'd help her understand complex regulations, and she'd help him with his English essays. They'd made it a habit to have dinner together every night, no matter how busy their schedules got. The simple act of sharing a home-cooked meal at their own table never lost its sweetness. His grades, already good, soared even higher now that he had a quiet place to study and a full stomach to help him concentrate. The engineering mentorship program the developer had connected him with opened up a whole new world. Every Wednesday afternoon, he'd visit the engineering firm, where professionals would show him how buildings were designed, how materials were tested, and how dreams were turned into reality through science and math. One mentor in particular, a kind-hearted structural engineer, took special interest in the boy's progress. "You have a natural understanding of spatial relationships," he'd say, watching the boy work on design problems. "But more importantly, you understand that engineering isn't just about buildings, it's about the people who live in them." The developer kept her word about staying involved in their lives. She'd stop by regularly, not just to check on the apartment building, but to have coffee with the boy's mother and hear about their progress. She brought books about architecture and engineering for the boy and information about advancement opportunities for his mother. The transformation wasn't just in their living situation. The boy watched his mother stand taller, smile more easily, laugh more often. The dark circles under her eyes faded as she got regular sleep in their own apartment. She started taking better care of herself, no longer having to sacrifice her own needs for his survival. Their neighbors in the apartment building became like extended family. There was the elderly couple downstairs who would share their homemade cookies, the single dad next door whose kids would study with the boy after school, the young nurse across the hall who would bring them soup when either of them had a cold. They'd gone from being invisible on the streets to being part of a community. One evening, as they sat on their small balcony watching the sunset over Atlanta's skyline, his mother reached over and squeezed his hand. "You know," she said softly, "when you told me you'd skip school that day to return the purse, I was worried at first. But you saw something I didn't. You saw that doing the right thing isn't just about following rules. It's about following your heart." The boy thought about how different their lives were now from just a year ago. He thought about the park bench where he'd found the purse, about the 3 bus rides across town, about the choice he'd made that morning. "Mom," he said, "remember how you always said our circumstances don't define our character?" She nodded, smiling at the memory. "Well, I think sometimes our character can change our circumstances." His mother looked at him with pride shining in her eyes. "When did you get so wise?" she asked, pulling him close. "I learned from the best," he replied, hugging her back. As they sat there together, watching the city lights begin to twinkle on, neither of them could have imagined that their story of honesty and perseverance was about to inspire even bigger changes in their community. Sometimes transformation doesn't end with one family. Sometimes it's just the beginning of something much larger. 5 years had passed since that autumn morning when a young boy found a purse on a park bench. Now, on a bright spring day, he stood at the podium as his high school's valedictorian, looking out at a sea of faces in the graduation ceremony. His mother sat in the front row, tears of joy streaming down her face, wearing a new dress she'd bought specially for the occasion. Next to her sat the real estate developer who had changed their lives, beaming with pride. "When I was younger," the boy began his speech, his voice clear and confident, "my mother taught me that our circumstances don't define our character. We went through some really tough times, living in shelters, not knowing where our next meal would come from. But even then, she made sure I never missed a day of school." He paused, looking at his mother. "She taught me that integrity isn't just about doing the right thing when it's easy. It's about doing the right thing even when it's hard. Even when you're hungry. Even when you're tired. Even when doing the right thing means taking 3 buses across town instead of going to school." A ripple of interested murmurs went through the audience. Most of them had heard pieces of his story over the years, but few knew the whole truth. 5 years ago, I found a purse in the park. Inside was enough money to have solved many of our problems, at least temporarily. But my mother had taught me that temporary solutions built on compromise values aren't solutions at all." The boy gestured to the developer in the audience. "The owner of that purse taught me something else important, that one person's kindness can multiply. She didn't just help my mother and me, she started asking questions about other families in similar situations. She looked at her own company's development projects differently. She started seeing the human side of progress. In the years since that day, the developer's company had indeed changed its approach. They now included affordable housing units in every new development. They'd started a job training program for homeless parents, inspired by his mother's successful transition. The apartment building where they lived had become a model for other transitional housing projects across the city. But the changes didn't stop there, the boy continued. My mother went from cleaning buildings to managing them. She finished her property management certification with honors, and now she helps other families transition from homelessness to stability. She uses her experience to make sure no one feels ashamed about needing help. His mother wiped away tears as several people in the audience nodded. Many of them knew her from her work in the community, where she'd become known for her compassionate approach to helping struggling families. As I stand here today, the boy's voice grew stronger. I'm proud to announce that I'll be attending Georgia Tech in the fall with a full scholarship to study civil engineering. But more than that, I'm proud to be part of a community that understands that the strongest foundations aren't built with concrete and steel, they're built with compassion and understanding. He pulled out an envelope from his graduation gown. Today, I'm honored to announce that the development company that helped us has established a new scholarship fund. Every year, it will help 5 students from homeless families pursue their dreams of higher education. They're calling it the Integrity Scholarship, but I think of it as the Ripple Effect Scholarship, because one small act of honesty can create waves of change. The audience broke into applause, many rising to their feet. The developer dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, remembering that morning in her office when a young boy's honesty had opened her eyes to a different way of seeing her work. As I look toward the future, the boy concluded, I dream of designing buildings that don't just reach toward the sky, but reach toward human needs. Buildings that don't push people out of neighborhoods, but bring communities together. Because I learned something important from my journey, the best kind of progress lifts everyone up together. After the ceremony, as people gathered to take photos and offer congratulations, the boy found himself back beside the developer and his mother. They stood together, this unlikely trio brought together by a lost purse and an act of honesty. Who would have thought, the developer said softly, that losing my purse that day would turn out to be such a blessing. The boy's mother squeezed her son's shoulder. Life has a way of putting the right chances in front of us, she said. The real blessing is having the courage to do the right thing when those chances come. As they stood there, surrounded by celebration and joy, the boy thought about that morning 5 years ago. He thought about the park bench, the 3 bus rides, and the choice that had seemed so simple at the time. Sometimes the smallest choices create the biggest changes. Sometimes one honest action can start a chain reaction that lifts not just one family, but an entire community. And sometimes, he realized, looking at his mother's proud face, the best way to build a better future is simply to live up to the values taught by those who love us most.